Hello, and welcome back to a weekly reading of Arthur, an Actuarial Odyssey. Now, I've been in recent communication with my publicist, so I did want to just start with a brief message. She spends a lot of time in Cancun, so she must be good. And there's a concern about building some kind of a following in a non-cultish way, but still a following. Anyway, the idea for those who may be able to do so would be to have people go to another Facebook website in addition to this one. It's not entirely correct to say I've been two-timing people on this one, but there's this other website that's caught my eye. And at any rate, it's called The Fictional Works of D.M. Baranoff. If you just go to Facebook and look for D.M. Baranoff, you'll be able to find that particular website. And it's a page, not a profile, so is a higher threshold for what I'm allowed to do there. However, that's not why we're gathered here today. Rather, today we're picking up the second half of chapter 4, where Arthur investigates death. Or should we say, as much the death industry that drives so much of our world today. When we left off, Arthur had just met a mysterious fellow at the bar at the Mortician's annual convention. And that man had told Arthur that he knew who knew the meaning and purpose of life. Arthur had taken up pen and paper. The man had said, "Put them away." And then it continues. "He is long since dead," the quiet man confided. "I see. He was a firefighter. I laid him to rest 10 years back, this very week. He was 35, a family man. He'd been a firefighter nearly 15 years. One day, the station got a call. A house caught fire on Houston Street. A small boy was trapped on the 3rd floor, not 2 years old. By the time they arrived, the flames were too hot for the ladder to reach the 3rd-story window. The fire crew stood below, helpless, horrified by the terror-stricken cries of the child burning alive in the inferno. His half-mad mother wailed and kicked and screamed, desperately wanting to rush back into the crumbling building. Jim knew his chances were slim, but the terrible, tortured cries were too much to bear. He pictured his own 2-year-old crying out his final frantic calls for help, and he knew what he had to do. Jim grabbed an axe and dashed blindly into the burning structure. The firefighters trained their hoses on the frightful flames, and when the fire's embers at last died out, when the final charred remains smoldered into ash, there was heard a little boy's cry from within the blackened ruins. No one knows just how he reached the child, and no one ever will, because there, only feet from the frightened child, protected only by a fire suit and oxygen mask that saved his life, lay the burned remains of a firefighter named Jim. Arthur fell back off his bar stool. My God, You see, my friend, only a man like that, a man who would face those flames to save another's life, could tell you about the meaning and purpose of life. Arthur stared in silence. Pity that men like that lack the luxury of time to delve into deep philosophical conversation about the motive or meaning behind their selfless life-saving act. Arthur slumped forward, emotionally comatose. Fortunately, however, in the case of Jim, he did leave behind a final note. You mean he managed to scribble his final thoughts while facing death on some miraculously surviving scrap of paper tucked within the child's protective fire suit? Don't be insane. It turned out Jim was a pathological gambler who'd lost his family's entire savings a few days earlier. Depressed and suicidal, he wrote out a note declaring that he was no good to anyone. He'd failed his wife, his family, and himself. He wanted only to end it all. So the real tragedy of the whole episode, once the insurance company found the note, was that Jim's heroic rescue mission was turned into a classic suicide firefighting story. So his wife and kids were out the family savings he had lost, along with any life insurance claims. The Firefighters Association took back all his awards and citations for bravery and now use his story as a lesson for young recruits to avoid work when feeling depressed or dealing with personal troubles. Oh my God. That's horrible. Where's the justice? Where's the sense of it all? You see, that's how I reacted. But then something got me thinking. What was it? A sullen Arthur asked, ordering another gin and tonic. I was standing in the rear of the room during Jim's funeral service, counting heads and noticing that there were 6 more attendees than had been planned for, forcing us immediately to change to a buffet-style lunch, when I noticed the minister, seated behind the person giving the eulogy, starting to nod off. And that's when it struck me. What struck you? Arthur asked, as he motioned the bartender to refresh the quiet man's drink. Don't you see? The man's life had been such a total and complete failure that even God was bored. I've seen it before. It's not something morticians really talk about in mixed company, but ministers falling asleep is actually quite common. Like God is channeling a message. A message, eh? What kind of message? I'm bored. God is bored? Precisely. Seen it too many times. Really? All I'm trying to say is, I think you're talking to the wrong people. The way I see it, if death is just a big bore to God, the answers must be somewhere else. I catch your meaning. But where? Where else can I turn? Just then, a voice called out from the shadows. Excuse my indiscretion. A tall stranger stepped out from behind a row of plastic ferns and approached the two. I couldn't help overhearing your concerns. And shot back Arthur defensively. And I think I might be of some assistance. The tall stranger had a wayward look about him. His stride was long and confident. His voice was deep and full. His hair was black and combed. If this tall stranger had something to offer, Arthur wanted to hear it. The quiet man hurriedly paid his tab and excused himself. Others, seated near the bar, retreated to more distant tables. A man at the jukebox stood studying the selections when suddenly the tall stranger halted in his tracks, raised his right arm, and without turning his head, called out for the man to play 11C twice. The soulful sounds of Michael Bolton's slightly strained rendition of Whitney Houston's smash hit, I'm Every Woman, filled the bar as the tall stranger took the stool beside Arthur's. Have we met? Arthur asked. That's not important. You say you have some information, Arthur continued. I do. The tall stranger reached down, striking a match on his left boot, lighting a cigarette, and offering one to Arthur. Arthur declined. The tall stranger lay his elbows on the bar and took a long, contemplative drag before turning back to Arthur. You say you want to know the meaning of life. That's right. And you think you can handle it? The stranger teased. Just don't waste my time, Arthur snapped, downing the last of his gin and tonic. The tall stranger looked Arthur over. All right, I'll keep it simple, the tall stranger answered. A long and dramatic pause followed. The tall stranger leaned back from the bar, turned squarely to face Arthur, and stared with a burning intensity into his eyes. Find God, he offered. The tall stranger took a final puff, tossed his cigarette, and ambled for the door. The sea of morticians parted to let him pass. There's just one problem, Arthur called out. Oh, the tall stranger answered, pausing in the doorway without turning. I have deeply conflicted religious views. In general, I see God as the imagined material manifestation of an alienated society suffering from mass psychosis in desperate search for unfulfilled truth and meaning in their lives. The tall stranger froze in his tracks. A hush fell over the bar. Raising an eyebrow, he turned slowly in his tracks, his gaze now fixed on Arthur. With slow, deliberate steps, he made his way back over to Arthur's stool. All was silent but for his steel-toed boots brushing across the bar room's polished floor. He stood over Arthur. You say you're a godless atheist? Well, your phrasing seems somewhat redundant, but yes, that captures the general flavor. Well, let me ask you this. Arthur sat with a smug, wry smile. Do you believe in the existence of automobiles? Certainly. And you believe in the automobiles because somebody sells them to people who then drive them, right? Something like that. And so one could say because there are automobile salespeople, there are automobiles. I suppose. Well, it's no different with God. How so? Well, there are ministers, people who sell God, as it were. Therefore, there is God. Well, I must say, I've never heard anyone put it quite like that before. I suppose you may have something of a point. Certainly, the tall stranger answered. And with that, the tall stranger disappeared back into the shadows as the bar crowd reoccupied their seats. Arthur was beside himself. Here, at last, was definitive proof for the existence of God. There could be only one thing to do. He had to immediately seek out the most commercially successful salesperson for God to dig up further answers. At that very hour, the Reverend Isaac Spindlestick was completing the taping of his latest infomercial for God. Reverend Spindlestick was easily among God's wealthiest salespersons. He had been marketing God and his products for nearly 22 years and could now be seen nightly in 5 out of the top 6 media markets across the nation. Arthur knew he had to find this paragon of righteous marketing and get some answers. The Reverend's press secretary said he could squeeze Arthur in the next day, around 2:30 that afternoon. But it would have to be quick. "It's a date," Arthur confirmed, and turned on his heel. That sets up a mighty meaningful and profound Chapter 5. He will finally confront and deal with on his own terms the Almighty. Very well then. We will see you then. Happy trails. So long.